Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about the problems when it comes to panning libraries. So when you pan libraries, the thing is the stereo field usually suffers a bit because in a natural live recording, you set the mics as wide as you want to get the stereo image that you want, and the perceived directionality of the instruments is pretty much set by how the mics are set. And generally, you will hard pan the Decca tree, left, right, center. You will hard pan the far away mics, the surround mics. And the close mics, you would pan a bit differently depending on what you want. But I mean, for the room mics, you pretty much set the room width and the room ambience how you want. But in libraries, you're pretty much stuck with the recording. So the only way to kind of make things wider is to repan the libraries. But of course, you're panning the rooms with it. And so panning the rooms causes issues because it can narrow the sound. That's just what panning does. So instead of the sound coming from, let's say, a wide kind of angle, if you pan too much a library, then the room can feel very narrow on the left, for example. And it would be a very narrow and kind of mono-feeling angle from the left, for example, if you pan left. So to combat that, what we can do is, of course, not pan too much. That's the first mistake, is panning too much, because now everything feels narrow and isolated on one side. But there's other things we can do to kind of mitigate that problem. But I think it's important to recognize like how different libraries might need more or less panning or more or less kind of stereo width and delays and stuff like that, because the thing is, if you do the same processing on all libraries, it's never going to work. Each library is going to be different. And I think it's important to be able to spot the character of the stereo field of different libraries to be able to adjust different plugins appropriately. For example, Precedence is a pretty famous plugin for spatialization. And so being able to recognize how the library sounds and use this accordingly is going to give you really good results. But you can also destroy the stereo field if you don't use it correctly. So I just want to give you a few examples so you can understand what I mean. And so if you adjust the stereo field accordingly, you can get a really nice sound. So let's talk about this. So for example, here we have a library that's pretty narrow by default, pretty centered feeling. Not narrow, it's wide, but it's centered. And there is a difference. A narrow sound wouldn't really image well in terms of stereo field, but a centered sound might be wide. You could have a sound that's in the center, but very wide as well. So these horns, this is how these horns sound by default. So it's a pretty wide sound, but definitely centered or more or less centered by default, right? So we probably want to put them on the left. But the thing is, if you put them on the left, let's say with normal panning, like a balance panner, right, it can easily sound a bit fake. Let me turn this off. Because now it's kind of a little bit isolated on the left. So of course you can just pan less. And that's fine, but there is plugins like Precedence which go a little more in depth by adding delays and using some tricks to just preserve more of the room. And so kind of determining how the library feels will allow you to adjust these certain settings better. For example, this parameter here, frec, is off for me here. But if you had a library that's extremely wide, for example, I had a swell here. Hold on. So this swell, for example, I'm using the same exact settings. Check this out, same settings. But because this is from a different library that's wider by default, it's less affected by this. Right? It's just because the library is wider by default. So some things you could do if you want more dramatic panning is to reduce the width. See? If you did that with the other library, it would feel too narrow and isolated. But for this one, you can reduce the stereo field and it's fine. Or you could use the frec knob here, for example, which just puts more high frequencies in the left ear and dampens the right ear. So it kind of isolates the signal more as well. Of course, that's too much. Because you don't want things to feel mono and isolated, like kind of mono-ish on the side. You still want to feel the room, especially on brass, because it's a distant instrument. So it wouldn't make sense to have it isolated, kind of, weird feeling on one ear. So as you can see, the source dramatically affected how this works, just because the source is different. And if you're going to have a source that's narrow, so this source, like this swell here is extremely wide. That's why it's not very affected and very narrowed by the panning. In fact, with this swell, it's just so wide by default that you can probably get away with a normal panning and not feel like the library is overly narrowed. If I just use normal panning, you can probably go pretty far. Yeah, and it's just wide enough to not feel weird, you know? Now, the thing is, if you go too far or if you overly widen things, you can also lose depth. So say, for example, you just put too much width on the brass bus. So for example, if I just grab a stereo enhancer here, right, now it's too far because the room starts feeling weird and it starts feeling overly wide, and actually you start losing depth. When something is too wide, it feels weird and kind of 2D-ish. It's easier to hear on headphones, but it just starts sounding fake and wrong. And that actually makes the sounds feel closer. So there are several tricks you can do. So if the sound is too mono and kind of isolated in one ear, you can pan less, but if it's just too narrow by default and you want to add more width, I made a video about that called the strings bus depth trick, which you can also use on brass actually. And it basically creates extra delays. So it puts the left signal on the right ear with a delay and the right signal in the left ear with a delay. And this kind of helps a bit. As you can see, it also basically puts some horns in the other ear with a delay. So it's almost like a room reflection. Now, all these tricks are, you know, there is a bunch of tricks you can use, but as I showed before, it really depends on the source. So I think you need to identify, is my library getting narrowed too much when I pan? If it's very wide by default, you can probably pan and not feel like you have any issues. Or if it's not a very wide library, and you put a lot of reverb afterwards, you can also probably just get away with it because you're not really panning a ton of room. Now, if you're panning a bit of room, a bit of decatry, you need to start worrying about, is it making my stereo feel too narrow and kind of, you know, like an isolated kind of slice in the space, and it feels not natural. In that case, you can use tricks like this doubler trick, strings bus depth trick. I have a full video on it. Or you can use precedence and set the delays accordingly. You could also use the width knob in precedence here to make the sounds feel wider. This is not quite like the doubler trick, but the idea is kind of to make the overall stereo image kind of more enveloping, you know, not just focused in one slice of space, but kind of bigger, like the range from which the instrument is coming would be a wider slice of space, if that makes sense. But yeah, also if you overdo it, as I showed before, it just can sound weird and kind of make the sound feel 2D and close to you and lose depth. So yeah, it's a tricky subject, but try to identify your library, how it's by default. Also, if it's quite a bit pre-panned by default, as I showed before, this one is pretty centered. So I could get away with kind of a lot of panning. But also I'm able to get away with this much panning because this knob here is off. If I put this knob, if I enable this one, it will be dramatic and way too much on the left. But yeah, all of this is just to show that don't be focused on just one type of setting. because it's really going to be so different depending on the track, the amount of reverb that you put, and mostly the library itself. If something is already pre-panned quite a lot, you might only need to nudge it a little bit to the side, and that's gonna sound great, you know? But yeah. I hope you guys found this video helpful, and I will see you later. Cheers!